Study Session 3 Foreign Policy and Diplomacy. Introduction. In the previous study session, we highlighted the evolution of the international system in relation to the state. The states are the most powerful actors on the world stage. In this study session, our focus shall be on foreign policy. We will also examine diplomacy within the context of foreign policy analysis. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to discuss the concept of foreign policy, discuss the factors that influence foreign policy of a state, distinguish between foreign policy and diplomacy, and explain the techniques or instruments of state interaction. Conceptualizing foreign policy. Foreign policy or policies are the strategies governments use to guide their actions in the international arena. You must note that foreign policy is not the same with international relations. Neither is it the same with international politics. However, foreign policy is one of the fundamental concepts that cannot be underestimated in the conduct of international politics. In the same view, foreign policy spells out the objectives state leaders have decided to pursue in a given relationship or situation. Foreign policy is thus a guide to actions taken beyond the boundaries of state and to further the goals of the state. Tip: much of foreign policy analysis is directed at the links between the intentions of behavior and its consequences. Basically, the intention of foreign policy is to affect the behavior of other actors, even if only in general terms. Nothing is distributed equally in the global system. Every state requires resources, economic goods, military capabilities, political and strategic support, and cooperation and coordination with other actors. Much of foreign policy analysis is directed at the links between the intentions of behavior and its consequences. There are different interpretations to the concept of foreign policy. Ofoegbu sees foreign policy as a set of ideas and thoughts, which often is the product of mental reflective activities and processes, which embodies judgment, choices, decision, evaluation, and systematic insight, appreciation of objective realities revolving around the milieu and seeking in solutions. This is according to Ofoegbu in 1980. Reflection. We cannot understand foreign policy without the concept of national interest. Thus, the formulation and execution of foreign policy is determined to a large extent by the national interest of a nation. To Jones in 1970, national interest is a term used in political debate within a country to signal the case that the item of policy suggested will bring benefits not merely to its proponents but also to its opponents. Foreign policy can also be conceptualized as a set of principles that define the objectives of a given state pursue in the international arena in the process of its interactions with other international actors. The concept foreign policy denotes the authoritative action which governments take or are committed to take in order to preserve the desirable aspect of international environment or to alter its undesirable aspects. It also represents the change of actions taken by various sections of government of a state in its relations with other bodies or states acting on the international scene in order to advance the national interest of that particular state. This is according to Akimboye and Otto in 2007. We cannot understand foreign policy without the concept of national interest. Thus, the formulation and execution of foreign policy is determined to a large extent by the national interest of a nation. To Jones in 1970, national interest is a term used in political debate within a country to signal the case that the item of policy suggested will bring benefits not merely to its proponents but also to its opponents. Note: diplomacy refers to the application of intelligence and tact to the conduct of official relations between the governments of independent states. It is not the same as foreign policy. While foreign policy is the goals and objectives which a state sets or designs to achieve beyond its national frontiers, diplomacy is essentially the techniques often adopted by nation states in order to achieve their foreign policy objectives. Having conceptualized foreign policy, we can also enhance our understanding of the concept by distinguishing it with a similar concept of diplomacy, at the same time pointing out the difference between the two. In this context, diplomacy refers to the application of intelligence and tact to the conduct of official relations between the governments of independent states. It is not the same as foreign policy. While foreign policy is the goals and objectives which a state sets or designs to achieve beyond its national frontiers, diplomacy is essentially the techniques often adopted by nation states in order to achieve their foreign policy objectives. As we go on in this lecture, you will see clearly the difference between foreign policy and diplomacy. Factors influencing foreign policy of a state. In drawing up their foreign policies, nation states must consider not only the goals it is attempting to achieve, but also certain basic facts of existence in the international sphere that affect its status. These factors are known as capabilities of foreign policy, and they include geographic strategic situation, population potential, economic endowment, and natural resources. Geography. The physical environment of a state can influence its foreign policy goals and objectives. It constitutes an important factor in determining foreign policy objectives because of its strategic implications. Two important limitations on policy are the physical environment of the state and the political military implications of its geographical situation. In the first category, the characteristics of size, climate, topography, and shape are important. An ideal norm, according to Rodi et al. 1983, will include 1. A size large enough to provide an adequate standard of living for a population and to maintain an adequate conventional military establishment. 2. A climate that is uniform and conducive to physical vigor, preferably either temperate or tropical highland. 3. A topography offering boundaries with natural defense barriers such as mountains, forests, swamps, rivers, deserts, and oceans. And 4. A shape that is relatively easy to defend in conventional warfare. For instance, Britain's separation from the European continent by a body of water, that is the English Channel, proved decisive in frustrating Adolf Hitler's designs to overrun the territory. Russia also proved a hard way for Napoleon's forces because of Russia's large territorial expanse. The point we are making is that few states possess all these advantages. Population. The size and socio-economic status of a nation's population constitutes another factor of foreign policy. The importance of China and India in this regard is becoming evident, especially as countries have shown some measure of difference to them in view of their large population. Nigeria is gaining some recognition because of the rate of growth of its population. States with smaller populations have not enjoyed such attention. Population as a factor of foreign policy depends on other related factors, e.g., quality of the population, political leadership, degree of national morale, prestige, etc. The staggering population of the Arab nations will not overwhelm the moral collectivity of Israel, nor could America's might subdue the fighting spirit of the Vietnamese forces. In summary, population may enable or prevent a state from achieving its foreign policy objectives depending on a number of other factors. Reflection. Population as a factor of foreign policy depends on other related factors. Examples are quality of population, political leadership, degree of national morale, prestige, etc. The staggering population of the Arab nations could not overwhelm the moral collectivity of Israel, nor could America's might subdue the fighting spirit of the Vietnamese forces. Economic resources. Of the various factors that influence and shape a state's foreign policy, the nature and condition of its economy are of primary significance. In the same view, the prototype of a powerful state is usually described in terms of a well-integrated and highly industrialized economy. Hint: a country that is not economically buoyant and depends on other states is incapable of making independent decisions on certain critical issues relating to its counterparts. On the other hand, a country with abundant economic resources has a solid base for exercising political power and making decisions without necessarily being influenced by pressures from within and without. It has been observed that undiversified economy can limit the options available to foreign policy formulation. Also, the economic potential of a country determines to a large extent the assertiveness of the country's rights in the Committee of Nations. A country that is not economically buoyant and depends on other states is incapable of making independent decisions on certain critical issues relating to its counterparts. On the other hand, a country with abundant economic resources has a solid base for exercising political power and making decisions without necessarily being influenced by pressures from within and without. Foreign policy requires not only a high industrialization and protection of foreign investments, but also the maintenance of access to critical resources. For instance, Nigeria's decision to champion the formation of ECOWAS Monitoring Group (ECOMOG) on the Liberian crisis in 1990 was partly motivated by its buoyant economy, which indeed made the execution of that venture realistic. Thus, a strong economic base is essential to, and in fact capable of influencing tremendously the foreign policy output of a state. Natural resources. The natural resources that a state is endowed with can also be a decisive factor in its foreign policy. The Arab world is endowed with large quantity of oil and thus provides a large proportion of Western Europe's oil supplies. The Arab nations employed this as a weapon during the Arab-Israel War, when they had to place embargo on oil supplies to countries that supported Israel. Instruments of foreign policy. We are going to consider 4 major instruments used by states in implementing foreign policy. These are diplomacy, economic measures, military, and propaganda. Diplomacy. Diplomacy is a political, legal instrument which a given state uses in achieving its foreign policy objectives. It refers to the use of tact, common sense, and intelligence to reach agreements, compromises, and settlements with other actors. It is the official state-to-state contact of communication, usually through the representatives of the state. It is also the central technique of foreign policy, presumably because other techniques revolve around it. Tip: diplomacy is the basic tool of state interaction in international politics. Diplomacy as an instrument of international politics. As earlier indicated, diplomacy is the basic tool of state interaction in international politics. This is because the process of reaching international decisions is through diplomacy. Thus, states maintain a formal diplomatic apparatus for conducting politics with other states. Diplomacy, according to Barrage in 2005, is an essential political activity and well-resourced and skillful, a major ingredient of power. Its chief purpose is to enable states to secure the objectives of their foreign policies without resort to force, propaganda, or law. It follows that diplomacy consists of communication between officials designed to promote foreign policy either by formal agreement or tacit adjustment. It is very clear from the above that there is a distinction between foreign policy and diplomacy. It is a peaceful means of settling disputes at the international system. However, since we talk of diplomacy, it is important to know those who carry out its functions. In this respect, diplomats are the eyes and ears of government in other countries. That is, a diplomat is the spokesperson of his government in other countries. The functions of a diplomat. The work of a diplomat may be broken down into 4 basic functions: representation, negotiation, reporting, and the protection of the interests of the nation and its citizens in foreign lands. Hint: another major function of ambassadors and the rest of the diplomatic corps are to gather information about the state to which they are posted, commercial information, political information, and military information. These functions are closely related. In the same view, the highest diplomatic official representing a country in another country is known as ambassador. Ambassadors are the officials charged by their state to conduct high-level politics with the state to which they are posted. A state appoints only a single ambassador to another state, and that person will be based in the capital city. Ambassadors or even higher officials from the foreign ministry will represent the state in negotiations over major agreements. Another major function of ambassadors and the rest of the diplomatic corps are to gather information about the state to which they are posted. Commercial information, political information, and military information. Economic measures. Economic instruments include the raising or lowering of tariff barriers or the use of blocked currency, barter or quota system for licensing imports and exports. It can also be through embargoes, boycotts, aids, and sanctions. For instance, assistance to poor states has offered a useful instrument for ensuring cooperation. In the same view, for several years, during the apartheid system in South Africa, comprehensive and mandatory sanctions were imposed by the international community in order to effect a fundamental change in the apartheid structure. Military. Military as an instrument of foreign policy is used mainly when other instruments fail to achieve their desired goal. The ultimate military instrument is war, which von Clausewitz called politics continued by other means. Propaganda. With the development of the means of mass communication through radio, the press, motion pictures, and television, propaganda has been an effective instrument of foreign policy. Propaganda is described as the act of influencing in a desired direction the domestic environment of the decision makers of other states to decrease their ability to oppose. Propaganda techniques also include cultural programs, distribution of books and literature. The main aim of propaganda is to influence the minds of the people. Some people also call propaganda a psychological instrument. You must take into consideration that the art of propaganda knows no national boundaries and is accepted by the leaders of all states. Discussion activity. What are the most important roles of embassies and high commissions in the conduct of foreign policy of states? Post your response on Study Session 3 forum page on course website. Study session summary. In this study session, we learned that foreign policy is a strategy that governments use to guide their actions in the international arena. Foreign policy is a guide to actions taken beyond the boundaries of the state to further the goals of the state. The intention of foreign policy is to affect the behavior of other actors, even if only in general terms. On the other hand, diplomacy is the techniques often adopted by states in order to achieve their foreign policy objectives. Therefore, diplomacy is the basic tool of state interaction in international politics. Those who carry out the function of diplomacy are known as diplomats. Diplomats' functions include representation, negotiation, reporting, and protection of citizens and state interests in foreign land. The highest diplomatic official is the ambassador. End of study session 3. Thanks for listening.